let's all just start by sort of centering ourselves. Maybe just close our eyes, take a couple of deep breaths in through our nose, and let go of the fire alarm or water alarm or whatever it was. Just breathing in and breathing out, sort of finding a center, an empty place where we're receptive. We can just pretend, sort of a thought experiment. We'll pretend like we just arrived here, like we don't know what's going on, and we're just observing the world around us that we note, coming into contact with new information, that it's the hottest year on record ever recorded. Just breathing in, looking around at our society. This morning I was reading the news, and there was yet another article on asteroid that is gonna, potential destroyer, dinosaur killing asteroid coming at us. I think it was in 2027. I actually read the article, but there's this impending doom narrative that pervades our reality. And if we look at our behavior, we look at the way we're collectively acting on the environment as a species, we're confronted with the fact that we have the potential to be a wildly productive species and a wildly destructive species. We're collectively challenging our biosphere. Plankton is under threat in the ocean. The rainforests, which produce a lot of the air we breathe, collectively are under threat. Brady, Bud's son, and I, when we were kids, we loved playing with fire. And we seem to be a very complex hominid that has learned to conquer fire, control fire, and burn it very effectively, to the point where we've got drills running 24 hours a day, every day, going down into the earth and pulling up this stuff, that this living planet that we live on seems to have a way of sequestering, and we are just burning it at an unbelievably effective rate. But we're now confronted with the fact that, wow, we have colonized the whole planet, and it turns out that our practices are not producing global well-being, but really global challenge. And I think it's really important to note that we're taking more than we're giving back. We're not acting like a lot of our indigenous ancestors. And it's not all that it's out of bad intentions. Ultimately, we are products of our conditioning. We think of ourselves as acting as individuals, but ultimately, we really are a collective organism living on this planet, and the behavior of this organism that we all are a part of is largely defined by the beliefs and ideas and things that are passed on to us by our teachers, our society, and my news feed is full of advertisements for body armor and video games that celebrate violence, rampant colonization, and the subjugation of nature. We're launching ourselves through this very, very fragile atmosphere on flaming rockets. We're not behaving like a species that is secure in its life support system. And a lot of the media that we are receiving, even as scientists or agnostics or secular people, is influenced, I argue, by some religious mythologies which have conquered our mind. The two largest religions on the planet are Christianity and Islam. Right now, there's about 2.4 billion Christians and 1.8 billion Muslims. So over half the world population adheres to one of these two Abrahamic mythologies. And they share a very similar eschatology. So the eschatology is the study of the end times. They have a very similar creation narrative and a very similar destruction narrative. So these narratives say that we're living in a linear reality, and there's a beginning of time, and there's an end of time. And the end of time is somewhere on the horizon. So when I see one of those news reports on an asteroid strike or Yellowstone volcano that's going to cover us all with ash, it all sounds a little too familiar. So it's almost as though even our secular thinkers are perpetuating some of these mythologies, even if they don't look the same. We're told by both of these religious belief systems that we can expect a future life somewhere else, and I think it's very hard to motivate populations to change their collective behavior when the narrative says that we don't exist here in the future. If you believe there was an external power in control of destiny, and the power was coming back soon to create or recreate the world, and some would be punished eternally, and some would be rewarded eternally, what decisions would you make? Would you care about saving an environment you didn't think you had a future in? Well, we are all under the influence of this dominant mythology. So ultimately, I think our work as social psychologists, anthropologists, scientists, and religious leaders is to reshape the narratives so that we can motivate our fellow people to put ourselves back into an earth-based reality. If we want to protect nature and we want to be good stewards, I don't think we're going to be very effective when we've just taken ourselves out of the future. The human organism, again, is a collective organism. We behave a lot like ants, bees. We've been taught that we think as individuals, but the science doesn't really provide a lot of evidence for that. So you have this giant population of people whose belief systems are largely determined by their religious leaders and mentors. And it's not that there aren't really valuable ethics embedded in these religions. It's just that these religions come from a time where the information was completely different. 2,000 years ago, there weren't nuclear weapons. There weren't oil wells. There weren't fracking wells that are constantly burning off methane, just pumping carbon into the atmosphere. So the scientific doomsday scenarios are actually reinforcing a fear of apocalyptic demise. And Bud pointed out recently that apocalypse, the Greek word, actually comes from some hidden knowledge being revealed. Apocalypse, as a word, as a terminology, does not actually mean the end. This majority Christian country was the first to achieve the assembly of nuclear weapons, and we're the only country to have dropped these nuclear weapons on civilian cities, creating damage on a scale the biblical authors could never have imagined. So when the biblical authors, I mean specifically Revelation, which is the final chapter of the Bible, when it was written on the island of Patmos a few hundred years after Jesus died, the author was writing as a myth maker and ultimately trying to describe Roman occupation, and you've got, you know, 7-headed dragons and a whole lot of interesting mythological figures. The problem is that we're now very literally minded in our scientific education system, and we're still trying to interpret some very mythological principles through our scientific mind. And we can't underestimate the influence that evangelical Christians have, especially on U.S. politics and current U.S. politics. The Trump base have been profoundly influenced by religious leaders. And how would you act if you thought the end was coming? The time was running out. Would you continue to exploit the resources? Ultimately, when we look at our economy, it's exploitive, it's very short-term based. We're looking at quarterly profits. We want to return on investment. And ultimately, this economy is certainly taxing our life support system. But if we go back in time and we understand that this economy was built out of the Roman Empire, which was exploitive from the get-go and was about colonizing and about making people go into the world and be willing to kill others, our behavior begins to make a lot of sense. I argue that we're behaving exactly like you would expect a species to behave under the influence of this narrative. So the most powerful story on earth, shared by over half the world population, and ultimately this is the half of the world population that controls the two largest empires, the Christian and Islamic empires, who are really brothers and sisters in the Abrahamic faith. They both share the similar narrative and a total destruction of this realm of existence. And, excuse me, so when we talk about crisis as environmentalists, and I think it's important that we do, last night Tom Steyer was talking about declaring a national emergency. The challenge that we face is the more we freak people out, the more we push them toward these religious beliefs that actually give us psychological security. Because we're all participating in this sort of unhealthy economy, and when we believe the myth, our behavior makes sense. So I think we need to be really careful and provide a lot of solutions when we are trying to speak to the electorate, because the electorate is not secular. The electorate, I mean, the people that are electing our leaders are not thinking like scientists. They don't have PhDs, they don't have master's degrees. And I think it's very important that we shape our narratives as environmentalists. I run a nonprofit called the Open Mind Project, so we're specifically looking at the psychology of religion, and we're trying to bring together people from all different backgrounds to learn about the other, to learn about views different than their own, and also to learn about the history of the religious beliefs that we all, even an atheist has a faith system. To deny the existence of a metaphysical deity actually takes mental energy. So we're not talking about eliminating religion. We're not talking about trying to take people's religions away. We're just trying to give them a better, healthier relationship with their beliefs so that they don't hate people who don't see the world the same way as them. It's about preventing terrorism. It's about preventing nationalism. It's about preventing extremism. Because every time we have another shooting, every time we have another bomb that goes off, we're all set back. When people are living in paralyzed fear, they're not thinking rationally. And a critical thinking society is sort of a key component to democracy. So what do? While our behavior does not seem to make sense, it actually makes perfect sense in light of the collective conditioning. So how do we reshape the narrative to make people feel secure, to make people feel like, you know what, this planet is not gonna let us down. Our existence actually demonstrates the unbelievable resilience of the environment. we wouldn't be here if this planet didn't have a recovery mechanism. I was going to show a slide of a dinosaur, it was like a dinosaur in flames coming down at the Earth that a friend sent. And I think the quote said, we are the asteroid and the dinosaur. So it was a perfect image kind of to illustrate where we are. So we need to learn to speak the language of religious people. We don't need to be afraid, right? Like, we've been taught as a society that it's not okay to talk about religion. It's not okay to talk about politics. But ultimately, we need to learn to talk to people who see the world differently than us. Not to exclude them, not to other them, because we're not going to get anywhere. And there's a lot of sort of authoritarian governments that would like to see America collapse. And there's a lot of tribalism and nationalism happening here at home that really disables our ability to function as a bipartisan entity. So we must transition from a carbon-burning economy to a sustainable regenerative economy, and we must also transition from a dominant cultural narrative that is a doomsday scenario to a dominant cultural narrative that is optimistic, that places us in the future of a living planet not governed by a deity that is coming to destroy us. So it's like, how do we redefine divinity and cultivate love and respect and appreciation for all beings, placing ourselves back into nature, as Eden was saying earlier today. So it's not about existence or non-existence of God. It's about understanding that we all have a context, we all have a belief system, we all have a story based on the people that raised us, based on the society we live in. And ultimately, the more we can understand the other, the more we can communicate with the other. And that's what the Open Mind Project is about. When we look at the amount of capital and intelligence devoted to trying to explore space or the subatomic world, we find a massive amount of energy expended trying to figure out realms that seem to have us ever more confused. When it's not that these endeavors are worthless in any way, it's just that if we devoted all that intelligence to creating regenerative agriculture and a clean carbon economy that captures plastic from the environment, we could really make a big difference and act fast. We've got Bolsonaro, who's sort of a religious fundamentalist in Brazil, who has a policy of killing indigenous people, and ultimately this is where we are. And I think it's important that we do learn to meditate from whatever context we come from, to find a little bit of relief and a little bit of peace in the present moment, because the amount of information we have coming in is overwhelming and scary, and it is terrifying where we have gotten to, but we're all born into this together. We're all participants in it. So I mean, I know I'm guilty. I drive a car, and we have to be able to help facilitate security and care and compassion. And I think, am I out of time? I don't know. Is there a green light?
We're close.
So I mean, I've got some more, but I can close. I don't want to go over.
Can we ask questions?
Yes, please. Yeah, of course.
Yeah, I cannot emphasize how mark-on you are, and how brilliant what you said is. I would only include also that there's a Jewish narrative of the coming of the Messiah and a new day brought about by an external force. And because there's this concordance of these theories of the end days and how powerful they are, and how the cultural creative community completely is unaware of it, and the liberal Democratic Party seems to be unaware of it, I wondered if we could deconstruct this myth. If it came from somewhere like a Sumerian origin. So I wondered if you could talk about, where does this myth come from? Who created it? When was it first
The
articulated?
the sort of destructive Armageddon myth?
Yeah, the eschatology that the world will end in this fashion, articulated in Islam, Christianity, and Judaism.
Well, I would argue that it comes out of agriculture. So agriculture produces the first form of currency. It also produces the separation and highly concentrated societies. And if I control the store of grain, I can make you dig a ditch. I can basically create a slave class, just like when people are in debt in society. So ultimately, having a story that says you're going to get your just reward after you're dead is very effective at perpetuating your, oppressed status or subjugated status in the society. So I think anthropology, making sure that we're teaching anthropological literacy that explains, because there is actually an anthropological explanation for where the narrative comes from. And it comes from the Roman Empire. But the Roman Empire wasn't the first oppressive empire. It was just the one that produced Revelation, which, the Bible's the best-selling book of all time. And it is a book that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And the issue is that linear thing, the difference, I had a great Jewish studies professor who spoke about how Judaism is actually a post-Christian construct because Judaism has been forced to create itself apart from this religion that basically took, the majority of the Bible is the Old Testament, which is the Tanakh, which is the Hebrew, but the Hebrew Bible originally was just always growing. There was always new books added to it. There was always another prophet or another prophetic voice. There was a myth of the Messiah who would come. But ultimately, you had these prophets that were writing, and it was the history of the Jewish people. But then the Roman Empire took that and, composed it, in this very, very powerful literary piece. And I think that our species is not really, there's always new information coming to light. And so we need a living, we need a Bible that's more like the internet, that you can always add another post. It's like, I got new information now. Let's add a little something to the story here. Go ahead.
Given this cultural anthropology perspective, can we add messaging?
Stand up and louder.
Yes, thank you. So given this very brilliant cultural anthropology context that you talk about, could the environmental activist community target messaging to the religious leaders to embrace, the God's green earth, the natural harmony of human beings with God's green earth as a religious ethic? Could you discuss that?
Exactly. Yeah, so that's really the hope of the Open Mind Project, is to bring together not just religious lay people with academic experts, but to bring together religious leaders with academic experts who can sort of convince the religious leaders to take this new information and share it with their congregations, right? So it's like, no minister benefits when they can no longer breathe the air. They might be filling pews with the, really heavy-hitting, if you don't come to church on Sunday, you're going to hell or whatever. But ultimately, what if we help them bring more positive messaging to their congregations? I think that as human beings, we are attracted to a spiritual community because it gives us shared meaning.
So one follow-up question. There's about 36 million members of the evangelical Christian community who are very supportive of Israel, which is obviously, they made the desert green, they have advanced environmental technology, advanced soil health technology, and the Boyko Institute for Semi-Arid Desert Research in the Negev. So I think that if we could explain, perhaps have speakers, environmental speakers at Christians United for Israel, to explain that science from Israel, for example, can help save not only humanity, but also encourage this religious belief that this is a God-given right, but also an obligation of human beings to protect what God gave us, And I'm not religious, but I'm trying to understand them and see if we can help.
I really appreciate that comment, and I would say absolutely yes. I think what we can do is give Christians and Muslims the tools to understand that the book that they have is not the living word of the divine, which is beyond our comprehensions as sort of limited human beings, so that they can say, wow, like, you know, Jesus was killed by the empire for challenging the status quo, and the story that got told was not, you know, his literal teaching. It was ultimately a propaganda tool of an empire. Go ahead.
Aaron? Thank you for sharing this with us. I think it's so important. And through the Y on Earth community, as I mentioned earlier today, we do a lot of work with faith communities. And it's actually a lot of fun, because unlike in secular academic settings, I can go in and talk about things like prayer. I can go in and reference scriptures like the mustard seed parable, the power of the smallest. And, you know, Carl Jung was very taken by this topic. He was so taken, in fact, that he did a 8 or 9 year running lecture on Nietzsche's Zarathustra, referencing Zoroaster, which is one of the first religions dealing with some of these themes. Of course, Nietzsche said that he proposed this notion of das ewige Wiederkehr, the eternal recurrence of the same, as a way to rewire our own thinking vis-a-vis these eschatological end times programs. Nietzsche also happened to say that the greatest sin is a sin against the earth. Actually, through Zarathustra, this was said. I'm so struck by this. I don't usually talk about this kind of stuff because it's a bit arcane. However, I will confess to this wonderful family that my master's thesis is called Gaia, Psyche, and Tragedy, Nietzsche and the Ecological Worldview, read largely through the lens of Carl Jung's study of Nietzsche. And for whoever might want to read something like that, I'm happy to share it. Okay.
Thank you. In the back, yeah.
Would you please address including the, what's in the Christian, everybody says the Bible. There ain't no the Bible, the Christian Bible, as distinguished from any other the Bibles, huh? But I just want to point that out, because you say the Bible like there's the Bible. No, there's the Christian Bible. Anyhow, I'll get off that subject.
I was referring to the one that was assembled at the Council of Nicaea and the Council of Chalcedon, you know, a few hundred years after Jesus passed away. But I mean, there's lots of translations of it.
But the thing I wanted to address was the whole, that statement about man being given dominion over the earth, and the destruction that has followed from people living like that is a given by God to humanity dominion over the earth and the animals and so forth. Talk about that, would you?
Yeah. Well, you said it. I mean, I would agree. I don't have a lot to add. I think it's been a very destructive mythology. That, you know, if it's, are we stewards? Can we? I think there are indigenous ways of knowing embedded. I think that Genesis can be read as a prohibition against knowledge and against manipulation of nature, because God says, I gave you everything in the garden, just don't eat of the knowledge of the tree of good and evil, which would be like the separation of this and that. But ultimately, yeah, the rest of the book has a whole lot of what you mentioned.
Just as the Bible, or whatever, has used out the word celibate, we should begin to start thinking of heaven on earth, as opposed to it being out there. That's what separates us. Whenever heaven's out there, then there's like the ego comes in and becomes the prophet of that. But we as individuals now have to create heaven on earth, and we have to become apostles of that.
Placing ourselves back into the future, right?
So we're going to gradually, maybe
There
one
was
more,
a couple more.
more questions, and then we're going to gradually transition, and I got a couple of quick things.
I wonder if you could talk about Eastern religions, which do not, I believe, have an apocalyptic end to the world.
Asking for,
They talk about Eastern religions, which don't have an apocalyptic end to the world, and how that narrative makes them different or like us.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I think, well, even the Hebrew, the Jewish religion really didn't have an apocalyptic end. After death was never really explained. And I think, yeah, a lot of Eastern religion, I mean, I study a lot of Taoist philosophy, and yeah, it basically says your nature. We're all one, we're all part of something bigger. We're all contained in the sacred hoop, to use more indigenous Native American terminology. But I mean, I think the wisdom traditions, we know that our entire species is related to each other. We all evolved in a particular place, and we have, there's a lot of us now. Chip?
Andrew, first of all, thank you for coming and speaking on this and sharing your wisdom. So, Randy mentioned the Bible. I want to mention the Green Bible, and there is such a Bible. I own one or two of those, and it's something that we might look at in terms of where they've sort of highlighted in the Christian Bible that part of stewardship over dominion, and I think that's a really important piece of this conversation that we've been promoting. And by the way, we've had the stewardship versus dominion panel, you know, year after year after year, with some of the brightest people from the evangelical community, et cetera, to really dig into this issue. So maybe you could just talk a little bit about, from your studies, how you have come across that piece of religion caring for the creation as opposed to dominating it.
Well, I think that's going to be the trick. If we want to organize populations, we have to acknowledge the reality, and the reality is that we have taken dominion over the earth. Her life is in your hands, dude, in the Lebowskian sort of terminology. We have buried nuclear material across the globe. We have enough destructive power to pretty much kill all of ourselves and the whole world. So the real question is the power of psychology, social psychology, narrative psychology, because it sure looks like we're literally creating the end we've been taught to expect. So
we have to change our mind.
Yes.
Yeah. Let's take one.
Jonathan's and Michael's, what I've always been not quite clear on, if there's the mechanism within the religions that there's life after death, and there's the reward, heaven and hell, I never understood where the apocalypse comes in. It's going to end everything. It seems to be redundant on a logical level, and I don't know where that fits into the myth of why there would be the end times and why it would be embraced when you knew that if you had a good life, a verdant life here, you'd be going on to the afterlife forever in that same manner. Is there any?
I think there's an archaeological and an anthropological explanation for the story, because there were these great flood events in the past. You know, we have had mass volcanic explosions. Human beings have seen these massive traumatic events, wars, and so I would argue that religion is a way that we're processing information. Religion is a projection of our consciousness, and so we're just living in these narratives of people that went through these massive traumas, but it turns out that the fact that we're perpetuating these narratives is actually causing us to be the trauma. Again, like, we're the asteroid and the dinosaur. So we're actually recreating the same traumatic patterns because we're still studying these narratives that really aren't necessarily still relevant. Like, we need a better narrative for the now, would be where I would.
So,
Let's get Joni.
Joni, let's get your we'll close the questioning here.
Well, I'm divinely happy that we're having this conversation. I think it's really important, and also that we can have a way to spiritually discuss our climate crisis and what is such an immediate importance. And several years ago, Jonathan at the Global Security Institute put together, because we were looking at a way to discuss the nuclear issue in ways that could bring everybody together at a spiritual level, and looking at it from that way. So he brought together the leaders of every religious kind of faith. Are you off the phone?
Right.
That you can, but for the first time, I've never seen it in my life where leaders from every religion in the world came up together in love and harmony to declare, nuclear, illegal, not halal, everything. And so that's almost a jumping off point for how we can embrace our message now in ways to discuss with all the various spiritual beliefs what our mission is right now coming out of this. So anyway, it is on the website, and when you see that event, it just was the most amazing thing I'd ever been part of.
Okay, so
we
could. This obviously touches a nerve in all of us. It opens our hearts. It challenges our minds to figure out why religion has had such a huge impact on all of our lives. For those that are inspired by this and it really lights your fire, I know all the way back in 1992 when I attended the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, that I was also part of the Global Forum of Parliamentary and Spiritual Leaders. So they do come together. And there are a lot of resources. The Global Peace Initiative of Women always brings all the religious leaders from all the faith traditions, all the wisdom traditions. So there's a tremendous amount of activity that's happening. I even was offered a free place to stay by the congregational churches during the Earth Summit when it was overflowing and nobody had any place to stay, at a monastery up in the Tijuca rainforest. And they were there specifically for the ICJP, the Integrity of Creation, Justice and Peace initiative that they've been working on since the 80s, the late 80s and early 90s. So if you want to dive into this, the information and the availability for really following a path of passion is out there for sure.
But we've got to include the scientists. We've got to bring scientists into the discussions. Like, that's the key. It's great to have all the religious experts, and those dialogues are really important.
Yep.
But how do we make sure that the scientists are getting the ethics of a lot of the spiritual teachers and vice versa?
And that's why it all synchronistically happened in Rio in '92. Marcos Terena from the Kayapo in the rainforest was inspired by his mother to invite all the indigenous people from all over the world to share their medicine and their knowledge at the same time that the Global Forum of Parliamentary and Spiritual Leaders was happening, at the same time the United Nations Conference on Development and the Environment was happening. So everybody was there intermingling, and they all knew about each other, and there was a Wisdom Keepers gathering on a high cliff above Rio Centro where we were burning a sacred fire 24/7. And the native people,
they drummed for the entire,
and they drummed throughout the entire thing. Janice was there as well.
Every day.
So
somebody kept the drums going and the fire going.
Right. So it's all in the mix. It's all in the mix. So if you want to continue this over dinner.